Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Stone Chapel Podcast. I'm David Capes. Today's something a little bit different. 3 guests, not 1, not 2. First, Lynn Cohick. Second, Sandra Glahn. Third, Nijay Gupta. Now, if you don't know who these people are, you will find out in the course of this podcast, so I'm not going to introduce them here. What pulls these 3 together, however, is their work, their efforts in helping us to understand the first Christian millennium, the first 1,000 years, from the standpoint of Christian text, but also Christian art, as it involves the role and place of women in the early church. Now, be ready to take a few notes here and make note of some outstanding websites where things are available to you for absolutely nothing. Free. Now, the Stone Chapel Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. We are dedicated to providing resources for pastors, teachers, and church leaders as they work in these interesting times. For more information, go ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. So here we go, 3 guests today with 3 important, historically significant, but also theologically weighty bits of insight into our history and perchance our future here on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Hi, my name is Nijay Gupta. I serve as Professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary in Chicago.
Dr. Nijay Gupta. Nijay, great to see you, my friend.
Hi, David. Good to see you again.
This time we're going to be together. We are talking about a book that you've written. Man, you're writing a lot of books. Called Tell Her Story. And here's the subtitle. Love the subtitle. How Women Led, Taught, and Ministered in the Early Church.
This is one of those books where, it touches kind of my passions and interests in ministry, and my wife is in ministry. So just exciting that a book like this is getting some interest and starting some discussions. There's this pattern where God's going to do the opposite of what you expect because it's about His glory and not our privilege. This idea that, okay, the disciples were men, the kings were men, but then you have Deborah, who is a very pious, successful, righteous leader in one of Israel's darkest times.
One of your earlier chapters, and it's a great chapter, by the way.
So these things start to raise questions. Romans 16 and all these women who are in ministry, Phoebe and Junia and Tryphena and Tryphosa and Mary of Rome and Persis and the sister of Nereus, the mother of Rufus, all these people. When we look at the New Testament, we look at early Christianity, women were everywhere doing virtually everything. What I realized as I'm studying Paul is women are often found outside the home.
Absolutely.
For example, Euodia and Syntyche are 2 Philippian Christian women who Paul says, contend with me side by side for the gospel, which is language of fighting in war. So whatever they're doing, they're not sitting around baking cookies. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And they're not cookies. Folding laundry. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Right.
But they're out doing what we think of as frontlines ministry. But just to give a quick example, one of the people that I give some time to talk about is a woman named Nympha. And I almost named her the most important Christian you've never heard of because she is somewhere in the Lycus Valley, modern day Turkey, Syria. And she is what we think of as an independent female leader of a house church, because Paul talks about Nympha and the church that meets in her home. And I used to think, if you're a host, you're just sort of unlocking the door, leaving some snacks and lemonade out, and you're disappearing. Kind of like if you're hosting a Young Life meeting. But in the ancient world, that wouldn't be true. If you're the host, a host is a big deal.
Yeah.
And think about what Jesus says to the people that host him poorly. He said, you should have kissed my feet. You should have anointed me with oil. Hosts have a big responsibility, and often in terms of leadership, because they're kind of like a small business CEO versus just someone that happens to own a house. And so the Nymphas or the Aphias, who's partnering with Philemon, or the Priscilla and Aquila, you have these women that seem to be heavily involved in ministry. And so I really wanted to shine a spotlight on the named women leaders of the early church that most of us have never even heard their names before.
Yeah. Some of the people that you talk about in the book, I mean, you have whole chapters dedicated to, for example, Phoebe and Prisca and Junia. A lot of times people think of Junia particularly as a male. You know, some of the earlier translations, they have that. So when did that sort of revelation kick into you that, okay, Junia is not a guy, but Junia is a woman?
If I'm being perfectly honest, before seminary, I probably never read Romans 16, where Junia is mentioned. I would not have known that Junias with an S is a male name, and Junia with an A is a female name. But that is how it works when we look at the English translations. But here's what's interesting. There's a scholar named Eldon Epp who studied biblical manuscripts. That was his expertise. And he was able to trace that Junia was widely known as this person in Rome throughout the patristic period. And really sometime probably in the 12th or 13th century, there was a tendency in the manuscript tradition to prefer transitioning it to a male name. It wasn't absolute, but there was a kind of preference that sort of became dominant because she is referred to as an apostle. And there are probably some scribes or theologians that thought that's not possible, so this must be a man. And it really wasn't until the 1970s and 80s with Bernadette Bruton and Eldon Epp that there was this full recovery of the female identity of this woman, Junia, who's pretty amazing because she was not only an apostle, and she might have even walked as one of the disciples of Jesus. Some patristic writers speculate that she was part of the 70 that were sent out by Jesus himself in Luke 10. But she also shared prison time, either with Paul or around the same time as Paul. And here's what's interesting, David, that I learned that I don't find in a lot of other books on the subject. Women rarely went to prison, and they only went to prison for high crimes. You go to prison for crimes that are considered direct threat to the Roman order. So Junia is doing something pretty bad in the eyes of Rome to get thrown in prison. And even the term that Paul uses isn't his normal term for going to prison, which is desmios, which means to be in chains. He uses one of my favorite Greek words, sun eichmalotas, which means fellow prisoner of war, which means she's being thrown into a serious incarceration situation. But it's this idea that she's doing what we call hard time. And David, you know this from studying Paul, it's probably the highest mark of a Christian in Paul's book to do hard time, to be in chains for Jesus Christ. He only says that about a few people, Aristarchus, a couple other people, Epaphras. There are only 3, I think, people that he says have done hard time. Andronicus and Junia, a couple other people.
Well, one of the things I didn't know, I had looked through Romans 16 a number of times, found a lot of women's names. I didn't know that 10 out of 26 were women's names. I thought that's pretty remarkable when you think about the kind of world into which early Christianity comes, right? It's not a matriarchal world. It's not really a world of equality. It's a world where it's fairly strong, at least in the public sphere, dominated by men.
You know, what's amazing is I could not find another list in the whole Roman world of 9 women in one place with only positive things said about them. Now, you might have like a census, you might have like a family tree, but nothing like this where it's not just a list of names. He's commending these people. I call it an honor roll. You know, he's saying, this is the best of us. They toil for the gospel and they work hard for the Lord. That's the most common commendation, whether male or female. And I think that's helpful as we think about what ministry should look like.
Dr. Nijay Gupta, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Hi, I'm Lynn Cohick, Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Director of the Houston Theological Seminary at Houston Christian University in lovely Houston, Texas.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sandra Glahn, Professor of Media Arts and Worship at Dallas Theological Seminary in what today is very hot Dallas, Texas.
Dr. Cohick, Dr. Glahn, good to see you, both Lynn and Sandra.
Thanks for inviting us, David.
Now, I want to talk about this visual museum that you guys started. So what is this visual museum all about, Sandra?
I take a class of students every other year to Italy to study medieval art and spirituality. And I started noticing how much of the visual record of women in the church I had not picked up because I had only written the written record. But the visual record would have a 7th century woman holding a shepherd's staff, a crozier. And that was a very common visual thing, apparently. Women shepherd people in the earlier church's years. The super early church, even before we had churches, in the catacombs, you would hear about women that were bone collectors, where part of loving Christianity was providing a decent burial to someone who was martyred for their faith, and someone who cared about them would risk their life going and collecting their head or their hands or whatever mangled parts of the body, wash them. And because Christianity takes such a high view of physicality, that was important to the early church. And I thought that was just really beautiful. And some women lost their lives over doing that. Some women were tortured for doing that. Then I would see an example as a 6th century woman Christian who's carrying the elements of communion. And, in churches where I've worshiped, that would have been something that only the elders did. So it opened my eyes to the visual record says things that the written record doesn't do. But there was really no one clearinghouse that I could find that put all of those artifacts in one place. I might go to, let's say, the Church of Mary Maggiore, and there might be a book on the art at that church. There might even be a book on the women in Ravenna. But nobody that I could find had taken the women in Mary Maggiore and the women in Ravenna and the women in, XYZ place, so that we could see what was the church in the 9th century doing, what was the church in the 7th century doing. And since the church has so much of it been pre-literate throughout history, much of our history has been told in pictures, in mosaics, in frescoes. And so our goal, it's Dr. Cohick and Dr. George Kalantzis in Wheaton, and then I'm at DTS, and the three of us are collaborating to create what Lynn has named the Visual Museum, visualmuseum.gallery. We're starting to collect these pictures, and then she has been assigning her master's and doctoral students to do vetted research on these people. So we're not just getting somebody's opinion, we're getting really good, solid academic work attached to the project.
That sounds really interesting. It strikes me particularly that the visual record is so different from what you get in the written record sometimes.
I compare it to looking at the church's town hall meeting notes to comparing it to the church bulletin. Town hall meeting notes are going to record all the conflicts, who the difficult elders were, but the bulletin is going to say who was playing bunco and when there was a youth retreat and who brought casseroles and who we need to pray for, who got a hospital visit. It's much more accurate record of the day-to-day workings of the church. And I think the Visual Museum records more of that sort of activity.
One of the things, as Sandra and I have teamed up to take a group of students over to Italy, we did this earlier this year, was the students' reaction of, I never knew this. I never saw this. Who is this woman that seemed to play such a role within the church's imagination of her generation and beyond? And I don't even know her. I come at this from the textual standpoint, looking at the early martyrs of the church, the women, what women have done as they helped shape Christianity in the early centuries. And I was just astonished at this visual record that supports the little bit that we have in the text and goes beyond that. And it's church's history. It's our history. And we really wanted a way for it to be accessible for free. As Sandra said, it's hard to find a comprehensive book or access, and oftentimes museums, it costs money to be part of, to get online to see what they have. And we really wanted this visual museum to be free for the church.
One of our pleasant surprises has been the gender parity. So it's not just been to discover women. It's been to see that in the early centuries, women and men are always represented together. You would have a man and a woman at the altar in a couple different artifacts, whether it's mosaics, whether it's in the marble. If you would have an arch of the 12 apostles, on the inner arch, you would have 8 women. So just to see how much the earlier centuries of the church were emphasizing this partnership of men and women.
When you look at the virtual museum online, you're seeing more than the images. I mean, I read yesterday a number of the stories that are associated with them and some of the details about the artwork itself. Maybe an art historian has helped you with some of that, I don't know, because it's not always self-evident when you're looking at an image what you're looking at or what the significance of it is. As you said, a woman carrying the elements, that sure seems like a fairly important priestly role. Or having the crozier, that's like being a bishop. So all of these things are pretty important, but they do need a little explanation along the way.
And they've been really excited to do so. You know, they've enjoyed digging into the world of art history, the world of theology that so often is demonstrated in what figures are shown to be doing or what they're wearing. So the students have researched, and as well as scholars. I think I want to stress that as we look at these women from the early centuries, this is the history of all Christians today. This is not Orthodox or Catholic history. This is church history. This is our history. And that's something I feel is really important for Christians to know today. These are part of the great cloud of witness, the global church. And in the ancient world, like Augustine, for example, has done a couple of sermons on the martyrs Perpetua and Felicity. These women lived in the life of the early church, both men and women. They were household names. We'd like to bring them back into the household again.
Yeah, that's a great vision.
I would love to share briefly. We had a student of color who had never seen herself depicted in the art. And she was with us on the Italy trip, and she burst into tears and said, I was here.
Well, I wish you both well in this. I think it's a great project, bringing to light these saints from the past, some of whose stories we know very little about. But we need to know. We need to know the history here much more precisely than we've been able to reconstruct it simply from written records. Sandra, Lynn, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much,
so much.
David.
I'm so grateful for our important guest. God willing, they will be back. If you appreciate and enjoy this podcast, be sure to rate us highly, leave a comment, and that will help other people to find us. Also, be sure to check out our sister podcast, Exegetically Speaking. It focuses upon, exegesis. We get a bit nerdy when it comes to Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, but that's okay. It's a lot of fun for those who are serious about the Bible. Now, the Stone Chapel podcast comes to you courtesy of the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center in Houston, Texas. Thanks to all our team who help us get this podcast produced, edited, and published on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.